Welcome, everyone. This is the Covenant of Sinai with Rabbi David Silber. Thank you once again for joining and for coming today to learn. In this class, we join Rabbi Silber as he continues his ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh. The reception of the Torah at Sinai and the episode of the Golden Calf and its aftermath are formative events for the Jewish people. For today's learning, sources will be posted on screen from Sefaria, but you are always welcome to follow along in your own preferred copy of your Tanakh. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I know we changed the clock, and it's a 6-hour difference now between the States and Israel. Anybody, welcome, everyone. Okay, so we are in the midst of looking at what is known as the Ten Commandments. As I pointed out last week, the Torah never suggests these are commandments. They are 10 dibrot, 10 statements that we have in the Torah. There are probably more than 10 commandments in the 10 dibrot. In any event, these are some of them or all of them are presented in the Torah as God speaking to the people. Precisely how many of these dibrot are directly spoken to the people, how much the people hear, is the subject of a huge dispute amongst the medieval commentaries, and actually even in earlier sources as well. But everybody agrees that to some extent, there's a kind of communal revelation. For the medievals, this was very important because it was a way to, they thought, to buttress the argument that this is real, this is different. It's not just a revelation to one person; it's a revelation to the community at large. In any event, that's the so these 10 dibrot entered into the Jewish liturgy. The Mishnah says that in the temple, they would have a daily service in addition to the sacrifices. And one of the things they would say in the temple was they would recite the 10 dibrot. I'll call them the 10 commandments, even though they're not commandments. They would recite the 10 commandments as part of the daily service in the temple. And we know from the Talmud that they were also reciting these 10 commandments in the daily prayer service. At some point, they were reciting the 10 commandments. Maybe in the place where they would say the Shema. They would say the Shema, and they would say the 10 commandments as well. And at some point in time, the Talmud says, they discontinued the recitation of the 10 commandments in the daily service. That's in the Gemara. Why they discontinued? It appears the reason for discontinuing the recitation of the 10 dibrot in the daily prayer service was because in some circles, and I presume largely in Christianity, it was understood that these are the commandments. These are the main commandments of the Torah, and the rabbinic tradition is not so. The rabbinic tradition is there are 613 commandments. So the idea that there aren't 613, but there were 10, because of that kind of thinking, the recitation of the 10 commandments in the daily prayer service was actually discontinued. I would point out that when you look at the Chumash, we all know that these 10 dibrot are found in chapter 20 of Sefer Shemot that we've been looking at, but they're also found in chapter 5 of Sefer Dvarim. We know that the commandments appear twice with some variation. Zachar v'Shamar. Zachar is in Shemot chapter 20. Shamar is in Dvarim chapter 5. What is interesting to note, actually, is that, we're not going to get into this, but that in the book of Dvarim, shortly after we have these 10 commandments, we have the Shema. So the Shema actually seems to be related to the Aseret HaDibrot. So it's interesting that, of course, the Shema is central to the daily service, morning and evening. The 10 Dibrot were also recited, but they were removed from the prayer service, and only the Shema remained. Just as an interesting historical fact, in the late 19 turn of the previous century, even a bit before that, they discovered in Cairo, old Cairo, called Fustat, they discovered this Geniza, which had, thousands and tens of thousands of all kinds of documents, ancient documents. I mean, there's a gold mine there, and opened up all kinds of inquiry into the core text of the Jewish tradition, not just in terms of the commentaries. Some of the commentary, we had pieces of the commentaries, ancient Jewish poetry. I mean, it just opened up the whole field. It was an amazing thing. It's a place called Fustat. It turns out that this synagogue, because these Geniza was connected to a synagogue in Fustat, and that in this synagogue, it was a synagogue that retained the practices of ancient Israel. And what they discovered, among other things, there's a tremendous amount of literature written about this and about the Geniza in general. But they discovered that in the service in this particular synagogue, they would recite the 10 Commandments. Now, I don't remember if they recited it every day or just on the holidays, and where they recited it. I believe it was connected to Kriyat Torah, but they did retain the recitation of the 10 Commandments. And I think that's very interesting. First of all, it's interesting because you think that, say there's a rabbinic statement, we don't say the 10 Commandments anymore. We have this in the Talmud. Now, what do you think actually happened on the ground? Do you think because there was some proclamation that now, from now on in the synagogues, we're not saying the 10 Commandments? Do you really believe that every synagogue in the ancient Israel stopped saying the 10 Commandments? I would severely doubt that. We know, I'm sure we all realize from our own synagogues that many practices in synagogues continue even after there's actually no good reason for them to continue, because synagogues are places where precedent is very central. Why do you do this? We've always done this. So it's actually very interesting that in Fustat, we're talking about 1100 or something, that around that time, that they are still reciting the 10 Commandments. Anyway, but largely the practice is gone. You will see some in many Sidurim, actually, printed after the morning service, you will find the 10 Commandments. There are different things that are printed in Sidurim, which are not part of the actual service, but they're printed in the Siddur. And one of them is the Aseret HaDibrot. Some Sidurim still have the 10 Commandments. Now, this raises the question, what is actually special about the 10 Commandments? I just wanted to comment upon that very briefly and make actually two comments upon the 10 Commandments without getting into the details. But if anybody has any questions, I'll stop in a moment and try to respond. First of all, there is an idea that was circulated very early that the 10 Commandments actually, that within the 10 Commandments, you can find all of the 613. That the 10 Commandments are like basic, not just mitzvot, but sort of basic principles, basic mitzvot, and that all the other commandments can be found within the 10 Commandments. And there was a practice which to this day exists, particularly in Sephardic, in the world of the Sephardim, that on the holiday of Shavuot, they read what is called the Azharot. The Azharot were poems that were written, Sajigon as Azharot. And the Azharot are a list of the 613 commandments, which they recite on the holiday of Shavuot. And the idea behind it is that the holiday of Shavuot, we got the whole Torah. And the Azharot are working with the idea that the 613, in one form or another, can be seen as somehow connected to, or perhaps even emanating from, the Ten Commandments. So that's one very interesting idea about the Ten Commandments. But the Ramban, in his commentary, makes the following point. And this is actually a very interesting point. The Gemara in Masechet Yevamot, there is the discussion in the Talmud about this idea that a person can choose to be Jewish. You're born a non-Jew, but you can actually become Jewish. That's called Geirut. You can become a Jew. And the Gemara in Yevamot discusses what is the formal procedure that is required for a person who seeks to be Jewish. The Gemara presumes there's a formal procedure. When you read the Tanakh, you don't get that sense that there's a formal procedure, but that's the Gemara in general is trying to put everything into legal categories, into formal categories. And the Gemara says that in order to, for one who wishes to choose to be Jewish, for a man requires circumcision, ritual immersion, and bring a sacrifice. And for a woman, it's ritual immersion and bringing a sacrifice. Mila, tvila, v'hartzoa adamim, or tvila, v'hartzoa adamim. And those are the formal acts that are required. And then the Gemara speaks about the acceptance of the commandments. And the Gemara says if somebody comes to convert, Modin lo mixat mitzvot kalot u mixat mitzvot chamurot. The Gemara speaks about the requirement to accept the mitzvot. That is a very interesting and very important topic. I'm not getting into that. How many mitzvot, what kind of acceptance, etc., etc. That's a big hot topic, not for us. But the presumption is that there's a requirement to accept the mitzvot. So the Gemara says, one second. If you assume that the person must accept all of the commandments, but the person coming doesn't know what the commandments are. So we have to teach the person before they convert all the commandments. The problem with that is, by the time we finish the process, or even before we finish the process, they will have passed away from this world. You know what it will take to teach someone of all the 613 commandments? So we don't do that. We teach them mixat mitzvot kalot u mixat mitzvot chamurot. Means some commandments which are less severe, and others which are more severe. That presumably we teach them about, and the Gemara has a list of which commandments we might teach them. So that's the Gemara. So the Ramban al Torah makes the following point. Because where do we get this idea that if someone comes to choose Judaism, they have to engage in these acts of circumcision, of ritual immersion, and of bringing a sacrifice? I'll get to the sacrifice in a few minutes. That's what's required. So the Gemara makes the following observation, which is a very important observation. How can anybody choose to be Jewish? You're not born Jewish, you're not a Jew. Says the Gemara, no. The Jews chose Judaism. In other words, how did the Jewish people become Jewish? Says the Gemara, well, in Egypt, before they brought the Carbon Pesach, men had to be circumcised, and their families had to be circumcised for them to eat of the Paschal sacrifice. And then, when it comes to receiving the Torah, these 10 commandments in chapter 19, the Torah speaks of, God tells Moshe in chapter 9, go back to the people, and they should prepare themselves. They should wash their garments, which the Gemara talks about. The Gemara understands to mean not just wash their garments, but to ritually immerse themselves. So men had circumcision, all the Jews had ritual immersion before they received the Torah. And then in chapter 24, which we'll get to later today, I hope, in chapter 24, Moshe, when he comes down the mountain, we'll talk about that, he brings sacrifices. He takes the blood of the sacrifice and he throws half the blood on the altar and half the blood on the people. And he says, this is the blood of the covenant which God has made with you. Hartza'at damim, the bringing of the sacrifice. And that's what the Jews did to enter into the covenant. So the Jewish people have chosen Judaism, and the formal acts are circumcision for the men, ritual immersion, and the bringing of the sacrifice. Says the Ramban, our Torah, in one line, typical Ramban. He says, the 10 Commandments, Ramban says, these are the mixat mitzvot karot mixat mitzvot chamurot. He says, the Jewish people want to be Jewish. These people want to become Jews. Okay, they went through circumcision, immersion, going to bring a sacrifice. What's this business with the 10 Commandments? Says the Ramban, the 10 Commandments are what you tell the people, the convert. You have to tell the convert something about becoming Jewish. What does that entail? What are the obligations? And part of the obligations is the fulfillment of commandments, says the Ramban. So in the scheme of things, in the book of Exodus, the 10 Commandments are mixat mitzvot karot or mixat mitzvot chamurot. The typical Ramban, he has about one line, he makes this comment, and of course, if you think about it, not only very interesting, I mean, it's actually a very powerful idea that, so the 10 Commandments are the 10 Commandments, the 613, but you're not going to teach them all 613 because that process will take too long. You teach them some which are headings, which represent the core ideas of Judaism. Then, as Hillel said to the one who wanted to convert, to teach me the whole Torah on one leg, he said, "After Recha Kamocha." Now, that's a principle. Now go and study. What he was saying was that may be a core value and a core principle. Let's see. Now we have to see how that plays out. See how that plays out. In any event, I don't want to get into that story right now, but this is the Ramban. So the Aseret HaDibra for the Ramban are mixat mitzvot karot or mixat mitzvot chamurot. Okay, do want to make that point about these 10 commandments. Now let's get back. Again, we're not going to spend all the time on these 10 dibrot because that will be many weeks. I did want just to return to a couple of points about these 10 dibrot. First of all, when you read the Aseret HaDibrot, the one that jumps out at us, because it's longer than the other, it's more entailed because reasons are given. Some of the commandments reasons are given and some not. But the one that it jumps out, of course, is the mitzvah, the fourth commandment, which is Shabbat. Zacharet Yom HaShabbat V'Kadsho. So last week, I believe I mentioned, the question is, what does Zacharet Yom HaShabbat V'Kadsho mean? I wanted to add something to what we discussed last week. First of all, Zacharet Yom HaShabbat V'Kadsho in the Gemara is those words, Zacharet Yom HaShabbat V'Kadsho, remember Shabbat to sanctify it. That in the Gemara is the source of the mitzvah we call Kiddush. To make Kiddush on Shabbat, that is, the mitzvah of Kiddush is to make a declaration that on Shabbat, Zachar means on Shabbat, to make the declaration that this is a holy day. That's the mitzvah of Kiddush, and the mitzvah of Kiddush is upon the entrance of Shabbat. That's why we make Kiddush on Friday night, on the beginning of Shabbat. The Kiddush is simply a statement that today is Shabbat. That's Kiddush, and that's Zochoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho means on Shabbat itself to sanctify the Shabbat. There's a very long Ramban, a very famous Ramban. In this parsha, 10 Commandments, and around it, there are a whole set of very lengthy Rambans, more than any other place. Just in passing, I want to mention sort of basic Jewish literacy. Everybody should be familiar with this. We know that our own practice is that on Friday night, we make Kiddush. We happen to make the Kiddush holding a cup of wine, called a kol shel bracha. But the mitzvah is the rest. The mitzvah is the statement that today is Shabbat. It's a remembrance of creation. We also mentioned the Exodus. And then in the daytime, we also say Kiddush in the daytime. But there, the Kiddush in the daytime fundamentally is just make a blessing on a cup of wine. There's a practice to say a few other verses, but that's just a custom. That's not really part of Kiddush. Shamru v'nei the Shabbat, that's not Kiddush itself. Kiddush is appropriate, I guess. At night, we make a blessing over the wine, but we also make the main statement. Strangely enough, the Kiddush in the daytime is called Kiddusha Rabbah. The Kiddush in the day is called Kiddusha Rabbah, the great Kiddush. And which is very strange because Kiddush in the nighttime is seen as a Torah commandment. Zachoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, and there actually is a statement about Shabbat. The Kiddush in the daytime consists of making a blessing over a cup of wine. How is this the great Kiddush, Kiddusha Rabbah? So most of the commentaries assume that when the Kiddush in the day is called Kiddusha Rabbah, it's a way of saying it's not really a Kiddush. In other words, when something is really not as important, sometimes we say the great Kiddush. It's a Lashon Saginar. In other words, the point is, it's a Kiddush of minimal significance, but we don't want people to say, who needs it altogether? It's a cup of wine. No. It's very important. It's Kiddusha Rabbah. That's the consensus among the commentaries, almost all of them, except for the Ramban. The Ramban understands it otherwise. So of course, says the Ramban, the real Kiddush is at night, and the day Kiddush is an even Kiddush. But the Ramban says no. They called it Kiddusha Rabbah for a different reason. And this is actually a very important point about the Ramban or Torah. Many years ago, I gave a class on the Ramban or Torah, and it's something worthwhile doing. The Ramban is so important. And among many other things, the Ramban is, apart from everything else, he's a wonderful reader. He is a tremendously knowledgeable of the rabbinic tradition, giant. He's also a very important mystic. And the Ramban or Torah, very often, when there's a problem in language that he sees, he offers a mystical interpretation. So the Ramban says the following. He says that actually there are two aspects to Shabbat. There's the night and there's the day, and they're very different. And he resolves, among other things, the problem that is raised by all the commentaries. How come in the book of Shemot, the Torah says, Zachoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, but in the book of Devarim, as we saw last week, the Torah says, Shamar et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho. Zachar v'Shamar. What is it? Is it Zachar or is it Shamar? So we know the Ibn Ezra says maybe it's neither. They're just translations of what God said. It doesn't make a difference. They're synonyms. In the Gemara, however, Zachar is seen as a positive commandment and Shamar as a negative. In other words, Shabbat has things you do on Shabbat and things you are prohibited from doing on Shabbat. One is not supposed to do malacha on Shabbat. Can't work on Shabbat. However, the tradition defines work. And but the Ramban has a different concept, which is that Shamar is the night of Shabbat. The night of Shabbat is you don't really do anything in the night of Shabbat. You are accepting the Shabbat. The Shabbat comes, whether you want it to come or not, it comes. Our job is to greet the Shabbat that comes. Unlike the festivals that we sort of create the festival. We determine what day the festival is. It could be one of 2 days. Shabbat comes every seventh day. You like it, you don't like it, it's here. Our job is to greet it. Kabbalah Shabbat is to greet it. But the Ramban says, in line with many other Rambans, I just mentioned this because I think it's such an important point. The Ramban says Shabbat is not abstention from work only. Shabbat is the day where you do things. The Ramban cites the story of the Shunammite woman who runs off to see the prophet Elisha after her child has died. And her husband says, where are you going? You're going to see the prophet? Lo chodesh v'lo Shabbat. Well, why are you going to see the prophet? It's not Shabbos. The Ramban says, the Gemara says, you see that on Shabbat, they would go to the prophet. In other words, Shabbat is the day one has the opportunity to engage spiritually, engage with the world spiritually. You're not working. So what do you do with your time? So it's a day of study. Maybe you consult the prophet. You read the Torah. There are festive meals in the daytime. The basic kiddush of Shabbos, says the Ramban, is in the day. And that's why we call, says the Ramban, the kiddush of the daytime, even though it's not kiddush, kiddusha rabbah, because it's part of the larger project. I would say the larger project of the Ramban, which he sees as the Torah's goal, is Kedoshim Tiyu. So Shabbat is the day where we can express through our behavior, through doing things, we are expressing the idea that this is a holy day. It's a day for study. It's a day of contemplation. It's a day to connect to the sacred, etc., etc. So that's the Ramban says is Zochoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho. That's actually a very important Ramban. Just wanted to mention that. We could spend the rest of the weeks just on this 10 Commandments, and in particular the Ramban. That the Ramban says is Kedusha Rabbah. In any event, that's one Ramban. Then I began by saying Zochoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho is the rabbinic source for Kiddush. Means remember Shabbos, to sanctify it means on Shabbos. One might even say that they're interpreting Zochor more than remember, but Tazkir, mention on Shabbat that it's a holy day, which is what we do. When Shabbos comes, we say this is a holy day, Kiddush. But the Ramban was not satisfied with just that. The Ramban interpreted Zochoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho in a different way. And that is, it doesn't mean, says the Pshuto Shel Mikra does not mean to mention or to remember on Shabbat that it's Shabbat. But Zochoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho means remember that Shabbos is a holy day. Remember it all the time, not just on Shabbos. I would say even primarily not on Shabbos. Shabbos, is Shabbos. But what about Wednesday? But Wednesday is connected to the Shabbos. Wednesday, you think you're ready about next Shabbos. And the Ramban cited the dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about what point in time you start preparing for next Shabbos. Shammai thought the moment the Shabbos ends, you're already thinking about next Shabbos. He went to the market Sunday morning, found a nice fish, nice piece of meat. I'll put that aside for Shabbos. Beit Hillel said that's not necessary, but the Ramban says they don't disagree in principle. They agree that fundamentally the week revolves around the Shabbos, and that's Zochoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, to keep the sacred in mind all the time, and that this Shabbos should have an impact and influence upon what we do the rest of the week. The person who actually emphasizes that in his writings, one of the people, is the Sfas Emes. Sfas Emes was a Rebbe of Gur, and he wrote the Sfas Emes, among other things. These were drashot he gave on Shabbat. And one of the key points that emerges from many of his writings is that the idea of Shabbos has to pervade the way we think the entire week, not just on Shabbos. So in the spirit of what the Ramban is saying, that Zochoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho is actually not about Shabbos only, or maybe not even primarily about Shabbos, but it's about the entire week. That more or less is what we discussed last week. I added a few points, but I want to mention something additional, not in the Ramban, but in the Rashbam. There's a very interesting Rashbam on Zochoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho. The Rashbam says the following. It's found on the verse Zochoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho. Those who want to look at the Rashbam afterwards, Rashbam is Rashi's grandson, who really charts a different path in his commentary on the Torah. There's a group of these people. Rashbam may be the most significant one, who said, let's look at what the Torah seems to say, pshat. Now, the Rashbam, was, like Rashi, was a great Talmudist, and we have his commentaries on some tractates. We don't have Rashi, we have the Rashbam. It's one of the Balei HaTosfot, Rabbi Tam's older brother. He's a giant in terms of the Talmud, but he also writes a commentary on the Torah. And his commentary on the Torah, his pshat, often contradicts what it says in the Talmud. Often. And the funny thing is, as far as I know, he never makes any attempt to actually reconcile them. He simply, this is what it says in the Chumash. He believes in the other tradition, of course, but they're two different things. There's a tradition, a rabbinic tradition, drashot or whatever, which is true, and then there's what the Torah says, which is also true. And they're two different paths. So the Rashbam says, Zachar et Yom HaShabbat. The word Zachar is to remember, right? You're always thinking about the past, and he gives several examples. Always thinking about the past. So what does it mean, Zachar et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho? What are you remembering? So the Rashbam says, what you are remembering, Zachar et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho, al sheshet yemei Bereshit. You are to remember the mitzvah on Shabbat is to remember what it says at the end of the first creation narrative. What does it say? A verses that are familiar to many of us. Vayechu hashamayim v'haaretz v'chol tzva'am. Vayechal Elohim vayom hashvi melachto asher asa. That God, the work was completed in 6 days. God completed the work. God blessed the seventh day, and God sanctified it. And the Rashbam said the mitzvah on Shabbos is to remember those verses, Vayichulu, that completed the capstone of the first creation narrative. In fact, what's interesting is that the Rashbam's commentary on the beginning of Breshit was missing for many years. There was an attempt to find the Rashbam, to reconstruct what the Rashbam said, and it would appear that it was missing, at least one of the theories, it was missing because it was censored, because there were things that the Rashbam said there that many felt were inappropriate. One of the famous discussions of what the Rashbam says is the following. The Rashbam says that Torah begins with, in creation, right? It was night, it was morning, one day. So what does the Rashbam say? It says, Vayi Erev, night came, and then morning came, and when morning comes, Yom Echad, one day. In other words, when does the day begin? It begins in the morning, right? It was evening, it was morning, one day. Says the Rashbam, what it means is there was evening, so night came, and then next morning, when the sun rises, next morning, Yom Echad. Now, of course, what the Rashbam says is obviously true. It's so obvious that Kusuto writes in his commentary, doesn't bother commenting on it, just assumes that to be the case. This is what the Torah does seem to say, that the day begins, the Jewish day, the day of the world begins in the morning. The way we normally think of the day, right? We think it starts in the morning. See you tomorrow, right? It means tomorrow morning. See you first thing tomorrow. Now, how do you deal with the fact that the Jewish day begins at night? So it's not actually a problem. There's a way to explain it, but that's one of the theories that why the Rashbam is censored. But the Rashbam says actually, Rashbam actually in his commentary on Bereshit addresses a problem that Rashi and the Ramban address. the Rashi there raises the question, why, says Rashi, why does the Torah tell us about creation altogether? Why bother with the whole thing? Let's start with the commandments, says Rashi. For Rashi, the Torah is all about the commandments. So Rashi says, why does the Torah start with the? Why? So Rashi gives his reason based on the Medrash, and the Ramban there attacked Rashi. No, Ramban says, what are you talking about? We need to start with creation, that God is the creator. What are you talking about? That's a central belief. The Ramban is a different explanation. The Rashbam essentially has the same question, and the Rashbam makes the point that the whole creation narrative, the whole creation story of chapter 1, why is it there? Says the Rashbam, I'll tell you why it's there. Because the Torah in the first chapter, it's actually the first chapter in the first few verses of the second chapter, but Vayichulu is setting up already Shabbos. The purpose is to tell us about the seventh day. That the seventh day is a day that God sanctifies, and the seventh day is a day that God blesses. Right? Vayivarech oto. God not only did God sanctify, but Vayivarech oto, God blesses the Shabbat. Says the Rashbam, the entire first creation narrative is there for one reason, which is to highlight the seventh day, and that the seventh day is to be sanctified and to be blessed. And we have over here in the Ten Commandments, Zachoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, right? Remember the seventh day to sanctify it. And then later on, we have at the end of the commandment about the Shabbat, Al Kain Beirach Hashem et Yom HaShabbat Vayikadshehu. We actually reference in chapter 20, in verse number 10, we should abstain from work. Kishet yamim asa Hashem et hashamayim v'et haaretz et hayom v'et kol hashabon vayonach bayom hashviyi al kain beirach Hashem et yom hashabbat vayikadshehu. Therefore, God blessed the Shabbat vayikadshehu, and God sanctified it. That's what it says in the Torah, right? Vayivarach Elohim et yom hashviyi vayikadesh oto. Kivo Shabbat mikol mulachto asher bara Elohim la'asot. So that's a very important Rashbam. And I just wanted to raise a question about this. What does it mean that God blessed the Shabbat? There are blessings that run through the Torah, and they're very significant. Anybody who studied the book of Breshit, of course, the idea of blessing or conferring blessing is a central idea. God blesses Abraham, right? Abraham right away, right? Those that bless you shall be blessed. Those that curse you shall be cursed. The whole story of Yaakov and Esau, who's going to get the father's blessing, etc. The book of Breshit ends with Jacob blessing all his sons, blessing Menashe and Ephraim. So blessing is central to the book. But the first time we ever encounter blessing is not about blessing a person. It's about blessing Shabbat. So what does that mean, actually? I just want to put it out there. What does it mean that God blessed the Sabbath? It really raises the question about blessing in general. What does it mean? Which is why our observance, our remembering of Shabbat, we have to remember that. Remember that God sanctified the Shabbat and that God blessed the Shabbat. I want to put out one idea about blessing, something to think about, and then I'll stop and take comments and questions. I think the idea of blessing the Shabbat means when you bless somebody, well, what is the blessing? The blessing is that whoever you may be, that who you are or who you aspire to be, who you might be, will in some way play out in the world. That's the idea of blessing. Now, whatever gifts one may have, we hope that those gifts can be realized in a multiplicity of ways. That's the blessing. And that the Shabbat, God bless the Shabbat. Maybe the Rashbam is in this direction. The idea is that Shabbat is a day, and this idea of Shabbat, the idea of the sacred day, should be played out in some way. Should be recognized by people, by individuals, by by communities, that they will engage in this day in such a way that it brings out its sanctity. I think that's the idea of blessing. How that plays out, it can play out in a variety of ways. Rashi quotes a medrash. How did God bless the Shabbat? Says Rashi, Berachto b'man. The story of the man is a demonstration that Shabbat is a blessed day, because there was no man on Shabbat, and therefore Shabbat was the day that people had to prepare for. It means it's a very special day, because you're thinking about it. The idea I've mentioned before about Zochoret Yom HaShabbat U'Kadsho is not just on Shabbos, but all week long. That emerges directly from the story of the man that we encountered earlier this year. Namely, that you prepare for it. It's a day that requires preparation. Important things require preparation that don't just happen. We have these Aseret HaDibrot. It takes place on the 6th or 7th day of the month, but they came to the mountain on the 1st of the month. And they're told multiple times to prepare themselves for this event. So the idea of the man is a demonstration that Shabbat is special, is different. It's not a day that you work. The work is done on the other days. But Shabbat is a day for other things. It's a day maybe to contemplate what you've accomplished the last week, etc. It's a day that, because dafka you don't work, it's a way that you can reflect upon the work that you do. It's a way, in a sense, that enhances the work of the week by not working on Shabbat, etc. So this idea of Vayivarech Elohim et Yom HaShvi'i, says the Rashbam, that is what it means, Zachoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho. That's what we are to remember, and it goes back to the Rashbam that made the argument that the entire creation narrative, the first creation narrative, is all about the conclusion, which is the Shabbat, which is sanctified and blessed. Okay, I thought that was a very important Rashbam to be familiar with. Let me stop here for a moment to take any comments or questions, then we'll move to part 2.
So far, no questions in chat, but people are welcome to speak up.
Okay, no questions? Fine. All right, let me just make one other comment about these commandments. Again, we're not spending that enough, one could have a separate course on the 10 Commandments. But I did want to mention one other interesting commandment, which is the last command, the last of the 10. The last one of the 10, called Lo Tachmod Beit Reyecha. Lo Tachmod. Do not covet the house of your friend. Do not covet the wife of your friend, servants, animals, and all that your friend possesses. Lo Tachmod. Now the question is, what does it mean, Lo Tachmod? Not to covet. What does that mean? So the Talmud discusses this, of course, and it has some very interesting things to say about Lo Tachmod. Before I get to what the Talmud says, or at least one of the things the Talmud says, I did want to mention, because it's very famous, what the Ibn Ezra says here. The Ibn Ezra asks the following question. The Torah says, do not covet your neighbor's house. Says the Ibn Ezra, how could you refrain from that? What do you mean, don't covet your neighbors? You walk by a house. It's a gorgeous house. You're walking in the neighborhood. What a beautiful house. I wish I had a house like that. Says the Ibn Ezra, that is forbidden. I mean, why is that forbidden? I mean, first of all, how can you hold yourself back from that? I wish that were my house, that house over there. Says the Ibn Ezra, can the Torah actually legislate against that? So he has his answer. Well, here's what the Ibn Ezra says. He says, let's say, he gives the example of, you're in the town, and the king is coming to the town. And the king comes with his daughter, the princess. He says, no one thinks, says the Ibn Ezra, I wish that were my wife. In other words, in a sense that, because it's so far removed from you, it's another world. you know that this is the king, this is royalty, this is the king or whatever, and you're in a different place. So you're not going to think, boy, maybe that could be my wife, because it's not possible. So the Ibn Ezra said that's the attitude one should have in general towards what's not yours. If you have that attitude, then you won't even think maybe that could be mine. That's the famous Ibn Ezra. But he raises the question, how can you not desire something? But I think in the Talmud actually, they take it in a different direction. Because in the Talmud, lo tachmod is not just what you desire. If you desire something in the Talmud, you really want it, that for the Gemara is not a violation of lo tachmod. Lo tachmod is a case where you desire something and you actually take it. But if you once you take it, the violation is not just taking it, but also desiring it. And now, so if you take something that's not yours, you're just a thief. So what is that lo tachmod? It's lo tignov or lo tigzo. What is lo tachmod? So the Gemara says no. Lo tachmod is where you take it and you pay for it. I want something. You have a nice car. I want that car. I want that car. So I go to you and I nudge you. I said, please sell me the car. Sell me the car. Sell me the car. Please sell me the car. I'll pay. And finally you might get rid of me because you'll leave me before I take it, whatever. Or I don't even ask you. I just walk to your garage. I drive away with your car, but I leave the money, whatever it costs. I write you a check. That the Gemara says is lo tachmod. Now there are all kinds of discussions around this issue, under what conditions, etc., etc. What if you finally agree to sell it? After I nudge you to death, you agree to sell it. That's a question. But my point is that the Gemara is interesting. That Gemara shies away from the possibility that lo tachmod is just something you desire in your heart. It has to play out that you actually took it. Now, having taken it, you might be liable for what you did in your heart. In other words, it's not the taking that per se that's the problem. I paid for it. But there it's actually the coveting and taking. So it could be that the prohibited thing that you did was the coveting. But unless it plays out in reality, but I actually take it, I'm not violating lo tachmod. This is an interesting question, about is the desire. Now, the desire per se is not a good thing. Lusting in your heart, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but is it a violation of lo tachmod or not? And actually, as this raises all kinds of very interesting questions about lo tachmod. Because to what extent does the Torah try to monitor one's feelings, one's emotions? The Ibn Ezra thought it does, actually. You got to put yourself in a place where you don't desire something because it's simply out of bounds. It's simply not yours. Same way you wouldn't desire you're going to marry the princess. It's not going to happen. They're a different place than you are. So the Ibn Ezra says that's the attitude one should have in general to all things that are actually not mine. That's one approach. And there the focus is on the emotional side, the desire itself. And the other approach leans more towards, we can't fully control people's desires and feelings and stuff, but we can try to control what they do. And the focus is more on what you do than on your internal feeling. It comes up in other areas as well. Love your neighbor as yourself. Is what's important to love? Or is it what the Gemara says? What that means is, what do you mean love your neighbor as yourself? It means don't do to the other what you wouldn't want done to you. But it's put in terms of actions. It's not put in terms of my internal feelings. My internal feelings, maybe they're important. But loving you in my heart, that's a very nice thing. But how do I behave towards you? That's what's important it's less about the emotion of love. It's more in the rabbinic tradition about one's behavior. one's one's actions. In any event, this is again once again a big issue. But I did want to mention here the last of the commandments is lo tachmod, and maybe we'll come back to that at some point in the future. Because here in this set of 10 commandments, it says lo tachmod, but in the 10 commandments in Devarim, we have a different term of lo titaveh. So maybe that's another interesting question. Is there a difference between lo tachmod and lo titaveh? In any event, there's a lot more to say here. I'm going to stop here with these 10 commandments. There's, as the high priest said on Yom Kippur, much more than is written here, much more than I've recited is written here. But let me stop and take a couple of questions now, and then we'll move on to part 2.
All right, I have some questions in chat. First, the question, Lazo, with a question from last week: why did the Debrot begin with Elohim and continue with Hashem?
Okay, so this is, I had mentioned our hero the last 2 weeks has been the Ramban. In fact, he's one of my heroes every week. But the Ramban, as I said, mentions the Ramban is a Kabbalist. When I taught a class on Ramban many years ago, one of the points I made about the Ramban is he's a Kabbalist in more than one sense. In other words, he's a Kabbalist because part of the Ramban is al derech ha'emet, which is a Kabbalistic interpretation, which often has to do with the various called sfirot, the different levels of emanation of the divine. Each one has its own category. There are 10 of them, etc. So but the Ramban often has his Kabbalistic thinking plays out even when he's not talking about these 10 sfirot, the emanations, etc. That the Kabbalist, that the Zohar works with, the Sefer Yetzirah work with, etc. And for the Ramban, the names of God carry with it deep significance. For the Kabbalists, the names of God are very, very central, and they represent different manifestations of God. Elohim for the Ramban, and they carry with it multiple connections. There's multiple connections, multiple. I'm no expert in this, by the way. I know a little, very little. But Elohim, which is often identified with the quality of judgment, is for the Kabbalists, for the Ramban in any event, connected to the bottom, to the last of the emanations, which is called Malchut. Now that's the lowest level. Malchut, kingship, is the lowest of the 10 sfirot. It's the one most connected to our world. It's the level which contains, among other things, a hefty aspect of what's called din, of judgment. The God's name of Hashem, that name Yud He Vav He, is connected, among other things, to a different sphera, a different level, which is called Tiferet. And Tiferet is a kind of, among other things, one might say that Malchut is the world as it is, and Tiferet is the world as it could be. For the Ramban, those two sfirot are very, very central in his thinking. For example, when one enters into prayer, you enter in, one prays, one stands in the level of Malchut, the world as it is. And the prayer is the attempt to connect, maybe to imagine the world that actually could be. I remember the first time I taught the book of Shmuel, and I knew a lot less about these sfirot than I do today. Not that I'm any kind of expert, far from it, but I talked about Hannah's prayer. And what Hannah's prayer is about is imagining a different world. She walks into the world of Shiloh, the world of Eli, the world of Chafni and Pinchas, but she's able to imagine a different world. And that's what she's praying for, a world in which God's values are actually playing out in the world, a world in which the leaders understand that their responsibility is to reflect God's values. that I suggested that's what prayer is actually about. It requires a flight of imagination, which is not easy to do because we're all rooted for many reasons in where we are. For the Ramban here, the Ramban makes the point that when the people are standing at Sinai, I'll just say very, very briefly, for the Ramban, what Moses is hearing and what the people are hearing is different. What the people are hearing, people are understanding, is that Elohim speaks to them. They're on the level of Malchut. They're on a different level. So when they're hearing God's word, they're interpreting God's word in terms of their own situation, in terms of their own standing, their own level. They hear one thing, but Moshe is not a represented, was not connected to the level of Malchut. Moshe is connected actually in the Zohar to two different levels, but the one that's more central for our purposes is the one of Tiferet. Tiferet, the ideal world, the God of the ideal world is not Elohim. The God of the ideal world is Hashem, Yud Hey Vav Hey. Tiferet in the Zoharic thinking, Ramban's thinking, is connected to Moshe, yes, but even more to Jacob. To the right of Jacob is the Midah. On the right side is Chesed. That's Abraham. Abraham is represented by Chesed. That's an outpouring. That's an overflow. On the left side is Isaac. Isaac represents Pachad Yitzchak, the idea of judgment, the idea of limitation, the idea of Tzimtzum. And Jacob is a combination of the two, which the Zohar calls Rachamim. And the point of the Ramban, among other things, is that the different people, in particular Moses and the people who stand in a completely different place, are hearing something different. That the people are only hearing what God says in terms of their own limitations. They're hearing on the lowest rung, the level of Malchut, whereas Moses is hearing something very different. Moses is hearing what God says on the level of Hashem, on the level of Tiferet, a different level. So it is, I find this idea, whether you buy the Kabbalistic system or not is one thing. But the point is that the Kabbalistic system, these different levels, which are very complicated and extremely, they're very deep actually. And the idea that different people are hearing God's word because they stand in different places, and that the prophecy is not just some kind of abstraction, but that it involves a kind of human active interpretation or understanding. That's what the Ramban says about Hashem and Elohim. Now, it is certainly the case that apart from all this, there's a great dispute among the medievals, and it's very unclear when you read the book of Devarim, maybe we'll get to it someday, but how many of these dibrot the people actually hear altogether? According to some, the Rambam says they heard the first two, but after that they heard sound. They didn't understand anything, and Moshe has to interpret for them. So the different commentaries are discussing the question, how many they actually heard. But the Ramban is the one who ties it to Elohim in one hand and Hashem on the other. In chapter 19, when God speaks to Moshe, it's always Hashem, Yud Hey Vav Hey. Then the 10 Commandments begin with Elohim. That's the Ramban's understanding. Yes, we could say more. We'll stop with that.
And there's another question in chat from Ruth.
Yes.
Quote, I once heard interpretation of lo tachmod as referring to a desire so strong that even if the person with the desire can't acquire what the other person has, he or she will do everything in their power to deprive the possessor of the desired object. Is there such an opinion?
I haven't heard it formulated exactly. First of all, I would never say there's no such an opinion. There may well be. I'm hardly aware of all opinions. Yeah, I mean, I would say that means what if you desire something and actually never actually, what if, in other words, if you desire something, but it never results in actually taking it? That would be the question. But you make it means your question would be, what if you make an attempt to deprive the other person? but the person says, no, I'm not interested. And then you didn't actually take the object. I don't know. The cases that are discussed that I'm familiar with is where you actually do take the object. And by the way, I would also add that the first time we actually encountered the idea of lo tachmod, right? I would say the first lo tachmod is the primordial sin, the story of the Eitz Hadat, right? Because there, when it says the woman saw the tree, and among other things, describes the tree as ta'ava la'einayim v'nechmad lahaskil. There you have in the story of the Eitz Hadat two words. You have ta'ava and you have nechmad, which are exactly the two words that appear in the Ten Commandments. In the 10th commandment, here it's lo tachmod, and in Sefer Devarim it's lo titaveh. So Ruth's question: what about if you tried your best, you try to convince the person, but the person never actually, you were unsuccessful in acquiring the object? Would that come under lo tachmod? My gut tells me I don't think it's lo tachmod, but it might be lo titaveh. We have to look at that. I suspect that lo titaveh you violate, but not necessarily lo tachmod. As I said, the Talmud speaks about lo tachmod in terms of actually taking the object. Yeah. The question is, what if you actually pay for it? Is this question? I desire it, and I pay you for it. Have I violated lo tachmod? Maybe we violate something else, but so I don't know the answer. I suspect what I said is correct in terms of lo tachmod would not be, at least the rabbinic understanding of lo tachmod.
Well, what I was
The pshuto shel mikra might be something else. Maybe yes. I would say pshuto shel mikra, you do violate lo tachmod. Doesn't speak about taking it.
Right? I think what I was hearing was a person who would resort to sort of an act of sabotage to somehow alienate the person from his wife, for instance, or create a set of circumstances where the object that they want is going to be destroyed or otherwise deprived.
Right. That you have with the Ibn Ezra. In other words, the Ibn Ezra mentions that as a possibility, where you want someone else's wife or husband or whatever, and you act in such a way to alienate this couple from each other. That the Ibn Ezra cites. I don't know if he agrees with it or not, but I mean, but again, yeah, that is the Ibn Ezra quotes that opinion. I don't know if he agrees or disagrees, but yeah, I mean, again, we're talking about. I was talking about from the rabbinic standpoint. I would say we just look what the Torah says. Torah doesn't mention taking it. Torah says lo tachmod, maybe because it can often lead to that. But to me, that would be a violation. In terms of what the Torah itself seems to say. Don't act in such a way in which you intend, as you say, you want to sow dissension or something like that. Strikes me that's what the Torah is speaking about. Whether this conforms to the rabbinic understanding, that's a separate question. But the example you gave is in the Ibn Ezra. He gives exactly that example. You create discord amongst the couple with the idea that the guy's going to divorce his wife, and then you'll take his wife. It's all kosher. She's not married. So that might come under lo tachmod. Yes, that's certainly a good, strong possibility. Oh, anybody else? If not, I wanted to move to. Yeah.
I think the classic example of lo tachmod is kerem navot, that you want it and you go ahead and you do something to it.
Right.
So when I was learning lo tachmod, I think the emphasis is also on the idea of rayecha and sharo b'chamaro, that if you want something, you say, that beautiful house, I would like it, so I'm going to work harder or more money. Maybe I'll buy myself a house like that. That's not the ched. It's only that you want that one of that person, not if you
right. Agree. I agree. You see a nice house. I can't imagine. It's a beautiful house. Gee, it's so well built. I'm going to get a house that's built that way. I can't see why that would be forbidden. What's wrong with that? So you want that guy's house. That's a different story. And you want to, again, either you want to make an offer to kick him out of his house, but you're willing to pay for it. It's hard to believe. You see a house and you walk over to the guy. Listen, it's a beautiful house. I'll pay you X amount of dollars for the house. Would that be a violation of lo tachmod? It's hard to believe that's a violation. But but the guy says no, thank you, then you nudge him to death. That might come under lo tachmod, right. But of course, if you say it's a nice house, I'll get my own, and I'm gonna go out and get this buy in my own. He does something well. I want to imitate what he's doing for myself, but not to impinge on the other guy. I can't imagine that would come under lo tachmod.
Rabbi, it's
Yeah.
Sam. Ask
Yeah.
one question, only because it keeps coming up and it just dawned on me. So what about, pardon me if there's any real estate brokers in the audience here, but I mean, what about a real estate broker whose basic job is to maybe try to acquire for another that which belongs to someone else? And if you say, I want the house in this apartment house and I want the B apartment because it has more bathrooms. I mean, I'm literally postulating out of my head, but could that whole, please forgive me again, but could that entire profession be a lo tachmod?
Again, that's a good question. I mean, the question is to what extent. I mean, the fact is that people will buy property. Most people will buy property. I mean, you're living in a house for many years, you don't want to give it up. But there are people who live in a place, and if they get a good offer, even when they first purchase the house, they ask the question, is this a neighborhood where the value is going to increase or is it going to decrease? That's often a factor when people buy property. So therefore, they bought the property initially, and I think it's true most of the time, they bought the property initially with the thought, if it greatly increases in value, I might be interested in selling. I don't see the problem with saying to somebody in that circumstance, are you interested in selling your apartment?
Yeah, but I'm just going to suggest, I think that's a great answer. But my suggestion is when you go to ask them, you don't know what their mental state is. It could be like the woman said just prior to me, when she said it's like Navot's vineyard. You don't know until you ask Navot, listen, would you sell me that? And he goes, well, no, I can't. It's my father's apartment house. It's
right.
We've had it for 70 years. But what I'm saying is, the lo tachmod part is yours. How the other person feels about the vineyard or the apartment is within him, but you don't necessarily know that going in. So does the lo tachmod get violated once it hits your consciousness?
I don't think so. I'm look again. I don't.
I mean, it's such impossible.
I'm a Chumash teacher, you know what I mean? I'm not, but it strikes me that making initial inquiry, if someone's interested in selling something, I can't imagine it's lo tachmod.
Okay.
It's when you afterwards go through, as I say, devious things or put pressure on to sell.
Right.
That's right. That strikes me as lo tachmod. But
Okay.
simply making an inquiry. My point is that most people that buy, for example, apartments today or houses, you're buying it initially, for the most part, you buy it with the thought that it's also kind of investment. When people buy property, for the most part, at least in the world that I inhabit, they buy it with thinking, yeah, I'm buying this particular neighborhood. And one question is this a neighborhood where values are shrinking? Or is it a neighborhood where prices will go up? Because people nowadays, most people are not necessarily assuming they're going to be in this one house forever. And most people, not everybody, some people stay in a place for many, many years. But a lot of people, when they purchase something, they do take into account in our world the value of the property. So simply making an inquiry, I don't see as the issue. I think the issue is lo tachmod is more than that. It's not just making an inquiry. It's actually doing more than that. It's nudging the other person. It's pressuring the other person, etc. Or even worse. And that strikes me as lo tachmod. A simple inquiry, are you interested in selling? I can't see that as being a problem.
Okay.
This
Thank
is the world of halacha we're talking about now, and I'm dealing in the world of chumash. Okay, let us continue. We have
may I have
yes.
just one more question before we move on, because from Rose, quote, if you want the house, you will not stop there. You will want the wife, etc. Tachmod, objects that are lovely and give joy.
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I think most people would distinguish between the house and the wife. What's interesting about the house and the wife is that, once again, we come to the question of the order of the things. In other words, here in our parsha, it starts with the house. Lo tachmod beit reyecha, lo tachmod eshet reyecha, shelo v'chamaro. And the Rambam, I think it is, I saw this, talks about why is it in this particular order. So the Rambam says because that's what people typically would do. The Rambam says in his world, they would first, make sure they have a place to live, and after a man has a place to live, then he thinks about getting married and someone moving in with him, and then you want to build up. And when you're in there and you're married and you have your house, then you start building up your business. You may acquire things, you may have servants or whatever it is. So the Rambam is just talking about here about the normal order that things take place. What's interesting is that when you get to Sefer Dvarim, there the woman is singled out. Eshet Reyecha is mentioned first and separately over there. And there they say it's because that typically is there you come under Tachmod more. There you get into issues of an emotional connection, desire, lust, and stuff like that. So in Sefer Dvarim, it singles out, the woman is singled out in Sefer Dvarim as being separate. We understand that. And the property is a separate thing. They're both forbidden, but there you have the two different channels, the two different kinds of desire. Okay, it's already, let me say what I wanted to do. It's already 12 after 11. Let me say the following. What I had wanted to do in part 2, which we didn't get to, but I think we did touch upon, I wanted to bring out today some of the important discussions that our great commentaries bring to the Ten Commandments. The Ramban, I thought several Rambans, the Rashbam, I thought was extremely interesting. And this whole question of lo tachmod, something really to think about. And the questions were very important, really to try to get a handle on what this means. What I wanted to look at maybe for next week, we will meet next week. It's Shushan Purim. We'll meet next week. Shushan Purim is actually on Shushan Purim. This shop is the Purim Mishulash, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But Shabbos is actually Shushan Purim. In any event, what I wanted to look at is the question of the order of what's going on. And here we have a very basic disagreement about how chapter 24 and chapter 20 connect. We have a great dispute between Rashi and the Ramban, and I wanted to begin with that next week. It's really important. There's no place in the Torah where the question of order comes up, and as much as it does in these chapters, 19, 20, and then 24. What exactly is the order of what's going on? Rashi, of course, famously believes that the Torah is not necessarily ever in chronological order. The Ramban has the position that fundamentally the Torah is in chronological order, although he can book a couple of exceptions. And I said the Abarvanel goes even beyond the Ramban, thinks it's never really not in chronological order. But there's a very important dispute between Rashi and the Ramban, a real dispute, which is not about Rashi and the Ramban, it's about the Chumash. How do we read these chapters? So I wanted next week to take a look at chapter 24. Very important chapter. That's where Moshe brings the sacrifice. As I mentioned, that sacrifice in the Talmud is a component of conversion. Now, of course, we don't have sacrifice anymore, and one can become Jewish without the sacrifice. Maybe I'll talk a bit about that next week. But it really brings us to this question, basic question of how one reads chapter 24, which is a critical chapter. It's the chapter of Na'aseh V'Nishma. And once we get to chapter 24, then we'll go back. Hope we get to it in this set of classes and start with some of the rules and laws that we have at the end of chapter 20 and Parshat Mishpatim, which is a set of laws, which are extraordinarily interesting in their own right. So next week we'll look at 20 and 24.
One last question, or should
go ahead.
people take it to email? Yes. This is just from Ito, who I'm not sure if he's still here. What do mitzvot kalot and mitzvot chamurot mean according to the Ramban?
Mitzvot kalot and chamurot in the Gemara has to do with the punishment for the non-observance. Kalot and chamurot for the Gemara, it's not about the Ten Commandments at all. The Ramban uses that as a kind of analog. It's not the same. Kalot and chamurot in the Gemara are the level of punishment. If you fail to observe them, are there severe punishments or not a punishment? One of the mitzvot that I mentioned, for example, are giving a pay of lechet shecha and pay the gifts to the poor. which would come under mitzvot kala. There's no punishment. There's a positive commandment to do it. That's a whole other discussion. I mentioned that only because the Ramban draws an analog between the 10 commandments, which largely I would call mitzvot chamurot, idolatry, murder. These are mitzvot chamurot. These are severe, and the punishment is severe. Shabbos, these are severe. The only one that doesn't seem as severe is lo tachmod. Lo tachmod, coveting can often lead to doing very bad things, but that's just an analog in the Ramban. Severity is in the Gemara is a function of the punishment. You see from the punishment how severe the crime is. All right, then we will stop now. So hope to see you next week. Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you everyone for your good questions, and see you all next week.
Bye.
Take care.